The briefing room at Nellie's Air Force Base fell silent when the door opened, but it wasn't the kind of silence that comes from respect. It was the kind that comes from confusion, from assumptions, from the unspoken question hanging in the air like smoke. The woman who entered wore a flight suit that had seen better days, the fabric faded at the elbows, the patches weathered by years of sun and friction. She was maybe 5'4", her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun that had started to come loose somewhere between the parking lot and the building entrance. Her stride was measured, unhurried, the walk of someone who had nothing to prove because she'd already proven everything that mattered. The cadets seated around the conference table exchanged glances, some smirking, others whispering behind cupped hands. This was supposed to be a briefing from the commander of the 4th Special Operations Squadron, the unit that ran the most classified strike missions in the Middle East. They'd expected someone different, someone taller, broader, louder, someone who looked like the part. The woman set a worn leather flight bag on the table, the sound of it landing like a punctuation mark. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't need to. The name tape on her chest read Kine in block letters that had been restitched more than once. Her call sign patch, partially obscured by the strap of her bag, showed a raven mid-flight above 3 words that none of the cadets could quite make out from their seats. She moved to the front of the room with the economy of motion that comes from spending thousands of hours in a cockpit where every movement matters, where wasted energy could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophe. The projector hummed to life, casting blue light across her face, highlighting the thin scar that ran from her left eyebrow to her hairline, a souvenir from an ejection seat that had saved her life over the Hindu Kush 7 years prior. One of the cadets, a broad-shouldered kid from Texas with a family legacy that included 3 generals and an astronaut, leaned back in his chair until it balanced on 2 legs. His name was Bridger, and his smirk suggested he'd been waiting for this moment since he walked into the room. "Ma'am," he said, the word dripping with practiced condescension, "I think there might be some confusion. We were expecting Commander Kine." The brief said. "I know what the brief said." Her voice was quiet, almost gentle, the kind of quiet that makes you lean forward to hear better. She didn't look at Bridger when she spoke. She was busy connecting her laptop to the projector, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this particular dance in dozens of briefing rooms across 3 continents. The brief was accurate. The tactical display flickered onto the screen behind her, showing a satellite map of northern Syria, grid coordinates overlaid in white, known enemy positions marked in red. The scale of the operational area was staggering, covering nearly 800 square miles of contested territory, where coalition forces had been fighting a grinding counterinsurgency for the better part of a decade. Bridger's chair came down with a thump that echoed through the room. His smirk didn't fade, but something in his eyes shifted, uncertainty creeping in at the edges. The woman turned to face the room fully for the first time, her hands clasped loosely behind her back in the at-ease position that was more habit than conscious choice. The light from the projector caught the details of her call sign patch now, the raven's wings spread wide, the words beneath it reading "Widow Maker" in silver thread that had gone gray with age and desert dust. "My name is Lieutenant Colonel Mara Kine," she said, her voice still carrying that same measured softness that somehow filled every corner of the room. "I've been flying combat missions since most of you were in middle school. I've logged 4,200 hours in the A-10 Thunderbolt II, including 937 hours of combat time across 4 deployments. I've flown close air support for SEAL teams in Helmand Province, provided overwatch for Marine reconnaissance units during the Second Battle of Fallujah, and directed precision strikes in 17 different countries, most of which don't officially acknowledge our presence." She paused, letting the numbers sink in, watching the cadets' faces as the arithmetic of her experience began to override their initial assumptions. "I currently command the 4th Special Operations Squadron, which means every pilot in this room who makes it through advanced tactical training will eventually answer to me or to someone I trained. So when you ask if I know what the brief said, Cadet Bridger, the answer is yes. I wrote it. The silence that followed was different from the one that had greeted her entrance. This one had weight, the kind that comes from sudden recalibration, from the ego adjusting to new information it hadn't wanted to accept. Bridger's face had gone red, the color starting at his collar and climbing toward his hairline. He opened his mouth, closed it, then managed something that might have been an apology or might have been the beginning of one before Kine raised a hand, cutting him off mid-syllable. "Save it," she said, not unkindly. "You're here because you're good. Your flight scores from basic are in the top 5%, your situational awareness is excellent, and your instructors think you have the instincts for combat aviation. But good isn't enough. Not where you're going. Not if you want to survive the kind of missions that don't make it into the promotional videos." She clicked to the next slide, and the room was suddenly filled with the grainy footage from a gun camera, the timestamp in the corner reading 3:47 hours, the terrain below rendered in the green-gray palette of night vision. The aircraft's targeting reticle tracked a convoy of vehicles moving through a mountain pass, the crosshairs steady despite the turbulence that made the image shake at the edges. The footage showed what happened when precision and patience collided with violent necessity. The first rocket struck the lead vehicle with surgical accuracy, the explosion bright white in the night vision spectrum. The convoy scattered, vehicles peeling off in different directions, but the crosshairs never wavered. One by one, the targets were eliminated with the kind of efficiency that comes from absolute control, from knowing your aircraft so intimately that flying becomes an extension of thought rather than a series of mechanical actions. When the last vehicle erupted in flames, the footage cut to black, leaving only the sound of breathing on the radio, calm and measured, the voice of someone who just completed a task rather than ended lives. "That mission took place 14 months ago," Kine said, her eyes scanning the faces of the cadets. "The convoy was carrying weapons-grade chemical precursors to a facility outside Raqqa. Intelligence estimated the payload could have been used to create enough sarin gas to kill 15,000 civilians. The mission window was 4 minutes from identification to engagement. 4 minutes to confirm the target, get authorization from CENTCOM, and execute before the convoy reached a populated area where collateral damage would have been catastrophic." She let that sit for a moment, watching the cadets process the mathematics of compressed time and impossible decisions. "The pilot who flew that mission is standing in front of you, and I'm going to teach you how to do the same thing, assuming you can get past whatever preconceptions you brought into this room." The briefing that followed was unlike anything the cadets had experienced in their training so far. Kine moved through tactical scenarios with the ease of someone who'd lived them, her explanations cutting through doctrine to get at the practical realities of combat aviation. She talked about the A-10's titanium bathtub that protected pilots from ground fire, about flying low and slow in an era of supersonic fighters, because sometimes the mission required you to see the target with your own eyes rather than through a sensor package. She explained the psychological dimension of close air support, how ground troops fighting for their lives needed to hear the Warthog's distinctive engine roar, needed to see the aircraft making gun runs overhead because it meant they weren't alone, that someone was watching their backs from the sky. She showed them helmet camera footage from a mission over the Korangal Valley, the terrain so rugged and unforgiving that it looked more like the surface of an alien planet than Afghanistan. The video captured the moment when a platoon of Army Rangers pinned down by heavy machine gun fire called for immediate air support, their voices tight with the kind of fear that comes from knowing you're about to be overrun. The A-10 came in low, the 7-barrel GAU-8 Avenger cannon unleashing a burst that sounded like the sky itself tearing apart. 30mm rounds chewed through enemy positions with devastating effect, the aircraft pulling up and banking hard to come around for another pass, while the pilot's voice on the radio stayed calm, professional, calling out targets and asking for battle damage assessment like she was reading items off a grocery list. That's the difference between training and combat, Kynes said when the footage ended. In training, you have time to think, to second guess, to consult your checklist. In combat, you have the time it takes for someone to die, and that someone might be you or it might be the people depending on you to do your job correctly the first time. She advanced to another slide, this one showing a weapons loadout diagram for the A-10, each hard point labeled with the ordnance it could carry. This aircraft was designed to kill Soviet tanks during a war that never happened. Instead, we've been using it to provide close air support in counterinsurgency operations where the enemy doesn't have tanks or anti-aircraft systems or any of the things the Warthog was built to fight against. And you know what? It's perfect for it, because the mission isn't about the technology, it's about the pilot. It's about being willing to fly low enough and slow enough to put yourself at risk, so the people on the ground have a chance. The briefing continued for another 90 minutes, covering everything from radio communication protocols to the specific acoustic signature of different types of ground fire to the way heat shimmer affects target acquisition in desert environments. Kynes fielded questions with patience, correcting misconceptions without making anyone feel stupid, sharing stories that illustrated points without turning the session into a war story circle. By the time she dismissed the cadets, the energy in the room had completely transformed. Bridger was the last to leave, lingering by the door until the others had filed out. "Ma'am," he said, the word carrying different weight now, respect rather than condescension, "I owe you an apology. That was unprofessional and—" "It was human," Kynes interrupted, unplugging her laptop and coiling the cable with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd set up and broken down hundreds of briefings. "You made an assumption based on incomplete information. We all do it. The question is what you do when the new information arrives. Some people double down, defend their mistake, let ego override evidence. Others adjust, learn, move forward. Which kind of pilot are you going to be?" Bridger considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "The second kind, ma'am." "Good, then we're done here." She closed her laptop and slid it into the worn leather bag. "Your next briefing is at 0600 tomorrow. Tactical communications in high-threat environments. Don't be late." That night, Kynes sat in her quarters at the officers' housing complex, a bottle of water sweating condensation onto a stack of personnel files she was supposed to be reviewing. Through the window, she could see the flight line, rows of A-10s parked in perfect alignment, their angular forms silhouetted against the Nevada darkness. Somewhere out there, maintenance crews were working through the night, performing the endless cycle of inspections and repairs that kept the aging aircraft flying. The Warthog was supposed to have been retired years ago, replaced by newer, faster, more technologically advanced platforms. But every time the Pentagon tried to mothball the fleet, combat commanders pushed back, citing the aircraft's unique capabilities and the way ground troops responded to its presence. So the A-10 kept flying, kept providing the kind of close air support that saved lives and turned battles, kept proving that sometimes the old ways were the right ways. Kynes' phone buzzed with a text message from her executive officer, a terse update about a maintenance issue with one of the squadron's aircraft that would require a conversation with logistics in the morning. She acknowledged the message and set the phone aside, her attention drifting back to the window and the flight line beyond. 22 years since she'd first climbed into a cockpit as a wide-eyed second lieutenant fresh out of flight school. 22 years of deployments and briefings, of missions that went according to plan and others that went spectacularly wrong, of learning that leadership wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room, but about being the one people could count on when everything else fell apart. Her first squadron commander had told her that the military would try to make her smaller, that being a woman in combat aviation meant constantly fighting against assumptions and stereotypes, and the unspoken belief that she didn't belong. He'd been right about the fighting part but wrong about the outcome. Kynes hadn't gotten smaller. She'd gotten sharper, more precise, more focused. She'd learned to let her competence speak louder than any argument, to demonstrate value rather than demand recognition. The call sign, Widowmaker, had started as a joke, a reference to her tendency to return from missions with 0 ordnance remaining and multiple confirmed kills. But it had stuck because it was accurate, because when Kine showed up overhead, the enemy's chances of survival dropped to near 0. The next morning's briefing covered tactical communications, specifically how to coordinate with ground forces in situations where radio traffic was compromised or limited by terrain. Kine brought in a joint terminal attack controller from an Army Special Forces unit, a soft-spoken captain named Rourke who'd worked with her on multiple deployments. He told the cadets about a mission in the Sangin district where communication broke down completely, where the only way to coordinate air support was through colored smoke grenades and trust, where Kine had made gun runs based on hand signals from a JTAC pinned down in a compound courtyard, because the radio had been destroyed by a rocket-propelled grenade. "She came in so low I could see the dents in the aircraft," Rourke said, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone recounting facts rather than drama. 50 feet off the deck, maybe less, cannon blazing, enemy positions getting shredded. She made 4 passes, each one putting her directly in the line of fire from 3 different heavy machine gun positions. 4th pass, she took hits. I saw the tracers connecting, saw the strikes on the fuselage. But she held the run, put rounds exactly where we needed them, then climbed out trailing smoke and hydraulic fluid. Flew back to base on emergency systems, landed the aircraft with half her control surfaces shot to hell." He paused, looking at Kine standing at the back of the room. "She was back in the air 3 days later, different aircraft, same sector. That's the kind of pilot you want overhead when everything's going wrong." The cadets listened with an intensity that hadn't been present during the first briefing, their earlier skepticism replaced by something closer to hunger, the desire to learn from someone who'd done the things they could only imagine. The questions they asked were sharper now, more focused on practical application than theoretical doctrine. How do you maintain situational awareness when you're taking fire? What's the mental process for target prioritization when you've got multiple ground units calling for support? How do you manage fear in the cockpit? Kine answered honestly, without pretense or bravado. She talked about fear being a tool rather than an obstacle, about using adrenaline to sharpen focus instead of letting it induce panic. She discussed the checklist mentality, the way pilots broke complex emergencies into sequential steps, because trying to solve everything at once was a path to paralysis. She described the sound of her own breathing in the helmet, how she used it as an anchor during high-stress moments, a reminder that she was still alive, still in control, still capable of executing the mission. Over the following weeks, the cadets rotated through intensive training blocks designed to push them past their comfort zones and into the kind of stress-induced decision-making that defined combat operations. They flew simulator missions based on real scenarios from Kine's deployment history, experiencing the compressed timelines and impossible choices that characterized modern warfare. Some of them washed out, unable to handle the psychological pressure or the physical demands. Others adapted, growing harder and more capable with each iteration. Bridger turned out to be one of the latter category. His initial arrogance had been replaced by something more useful, a driving competitiveness that pushed him to outperform his own previous benchmarks rather than simply beat his peers. Kine watched his progression with the detached interest of a craftsman evaluating raw material, noting the moments when his natural talent merged with learned discipline to produce something approaching real competence. He was still rough around the edges, still prone to overthinking in situations that required instinct, but the foundation was solid. The squadron's deployment orders came through on a Tuesday morning, marked classified and delivered by courier. Kine read through the operational parameters in her office, the details painting a picture of the kind of mission that justified the 4th Special Operations Squadron's existence. Intelligence had identified a high-value target operating in the Euphrates River Valley, a logistics coordinator for a terrorist network that had been responsible for multiple attacks on coalition forces. The target moved frequently, used multiple vehicles and safe houses, and maintained strict operational security that made conventional strikes nearly impossible. The mission called for a rapid response capability, aircraft on standby to execute within minutes of positive identification. Kine called her senior pilots into the briefing room, spreading maps across the table and walking them through the intelligence picture. The target was smart, disciplined, never staying in one location for more than a few hours. The mission window would be narrow, maybe 10 minutes from confirmation to execution. They'd be working with special operations ground teams who would handle identification and laser designation. The air element's job was simple in concept and brutally difficult in execution. Get overhead fast, acquire the target, deliver precision ordnance in an urban environment where collateral damage could turn a successful mission into a political nightmare. "We've got 3 birds allocated for this operation," Kine said, tapping coordinates on the map. "Rotating 8-hour shifts, 24-hour coverage. When the call comes, we need to be wheels up in under 5 minutes. The target has demonstrated pattern-of-life behavior that suggests he moves during evening prayer calls when streets are empty. That's our likely engagement window. Questions?" Her weapons officer, a taciturn major named Vasquez who'd flown with Kine for 6 years, studied the map with the intensity of someone calculating angles and distances. "Rules of engagement. Cleared hot on positive identification with ground force confirmation. We've got authorization for Hellfire missiles or precision-guided bombs depending on the target environment. No cannon runs, too much risk of collateral damage in urban terrain." Kine traced a route on the map, showing the approach corridor that would keep them outside known anti-aircraft positions while maintaining response time requirements. "We'll be operating from a forward location, pre-positioned to minimize flight time. Intel estimates we'll have one shot at this before he adjusts his security posture, so we don't get to miss." The deployment began 72 hours later. Kine's flight of 3 A-10s staged out of a coalition airbase whose location remained classified, sitting alert in hardened shelters while intelligence assets tracked the target's movements across the river valley. The waiting was the hardest part, hours stretching into days while they maintained readiness, sleeping in short cycles, eating meals that could be abandoned mid-bite if the call came. The aircraft sat loaded and ready, weapons hot, pilots rotating through crew rest periods designed to ensure someone was always fresh enough to fly. The call came on day 6, at 1740 local time, just as the evening call to prayer echoed across the city. Kine was reviewing intelligence updates when her radio crackled to life, the calm voice of the ground force commander reporting positive identification and requesting immediate air support. She was moving before the transmission finished, muscle memory taking over as she grabbed her helmet and sprinted toward the flight line. Her crew chief had the aircraft running, the familiar whine of the turbofan spooling up as Kine climbed the ladder and dropped into the cockpit. "Widow 2-1, radio check." Her wingman's voice came through clearly, professional, and focused. "Widow 2-1 copies. We're wheels up in 90 seconds. Target package is already uploaded." Kine's hands moved through the startup sequence, checking systems that were already checked, running through procedures that had become as natural as breathing. The A-10 taxied out of the shelter, turning onto the runway where her 2 wingmen were already in position. Tower clearance came through immediately, priority handling that reflected the mission's urgency. Throttles forward, the acceleration pressing her back into the seat as the Warthog gathered speed. Rotation, gear up, climbing into the twilight sky above the desert. The target was 40 nautical miles southeast, a drive that would take an hour on the ground but less than 8 minutes by air. Kine's radar warning receiver stayed quiet, no enemy air defense systems painting her aircraft as she descended to low altitude. Using terrain masking to avoid detection, while the targeting pod slaved to coordinates provided by the ground team. The radio crackled with updates from the ground force commander, his voice tight with controlled urgency. Widow 2-1, target is mobile, heading southeast en route Dover. Black SUV, positive identification confirmed by 2 independent sources. We have laser designation, ready to mark on your call. Copy all. Widow flight combat spread. 2-2 your high cover, 2-3 your backup shooter. I've got the primary engagement. Kind's eyes scanned the tactical display, watching the distance to target decrease in measured increments. 5 nautical miles. 4, 3. The targeting pod acquired the vehicle, the image sharp and clear despite the fading light. Black SUV, moving at high speed through sparse traffic, exactly where intelligence said it would be. Sparkle the target. Ground force acknowledgement. And suddenly the SUV was illuminated by invisible laser energy, the targeting pod showing a bright return where the designation beam struck metal. Kind's finger hovered over the weapon release, waiting for the precise moment when angle and distance and speed converged into the mathematical certainty of a hit. 1 second. 2. Rifle. The Hellfire missile dropped free, motor igniting, accelerating toward the target with single-minded purpose. 17 seconds from launch to impact. The SUV tried to accelerate, the driver perhaps sensing danger or simply responding to traffic conditions. It didn't matter. The missile seeker head stayed locked on the laser designation, guidance fins making micro-adjustments to keep the weapon on course. Impact came with clinical precision, the warhead detonating exactly where physics and engineering promised it would. The SUV erupted in flames, secondary explosions suggesting ammunition or explosives in the vehicle adding to the initial blast. Target destroyed. Battle damage assessment shows complete vehicle destruction, no observed collateral damage. The ground force commander's voice carried satisfaction but no triumph, just the acknowledgement of a job completed according to plan. Kind circled overhead, the targeting pod recording footage for post-mission analysis while her wingmen maintained watch for any ground-based threats. The mission had taken 8 minutes from alert to execution, 8 minutes that represented hundreds of hours of training and planning and coordination. The flight back to base was quiet, the radio traffic limited to necessary communications and position reports. Kind felt the familiar post-mission clarity. The way time seemed to slow down after the compression of combat, allowing space for thought and reflection. Another mission complete. Another high-value target eliminated. Another small piece removed from the network of violence that fed regional instability. It never felt like victory, exactly. More like maintenance, like mowing a lawn that would grow back no matter how often you cut it. Debriefing lasted 3 hours. Intelligence officers poring over the gun camera footage and mission data, while Kine and her pilots walked through each decision point, each communication, each moment of tactical execution. The consensus was clear. Textbook mission, flawless execution, exactly the kind of precision strike that justified the resources allocated to Special Operations Aviation. Congratulations were offered and accepted with the muted professionalism of people who understood that celebration was premature when tomorrow might bring another mission, another target, another roll of the dice. That night, unable to sleep, Kine walked the flight line alone. The A-10s sat in their shelters, motionless in the desert darkness, waiting for the next call that would send them back into the sky. She ran her hand along the fuselage of her aircraft, feeling the patches where battle damage had been repaired, the slight imperfections in the metal where technicians had worked miracles to keep an aging airframe mission ready. This particular Warthog had been built in 1979, 6 years before Kine was born. It had flown in Desert Storm, over the Balkans, through 2 decades of Middle Eastern conflicts. How many pilots had sat in this cockpit? How many missions had it flown? How many lives had it saved and taken? The questions felt heavier than usual tonight, the weight of accumulated experience pressing down like atmospheric pressure before a storm. Kine had joined the Air Force with idealistic notions about service and patriotism, about defending freedom and making the world safer. 22 years later, she understood that the reality was more complicated, more morally ambiguous, more grinding and endless than her younger self could have imagined. But she also understood that complexity didn't absolve her of responsibility, that ambiguity didn't justify withdrawal. The mission still mattered. The people still needed protecting. The work still had to be done. Back at Nellie's, the cadet class progressed through advanced tactical training with the intensity of people who'd seen what excellence looked like and understood the gap between their current capabilities and that standard. Bridger had become the unofficial leader of his cohort, using his natural competitiveness to drive group performance rather than individual achievement. He studied Kine's deployment reports obsessively, analyzing her decision-making in specific tactical scenarios, trying to understand the thought processes that led to successful outcomes in situations where failure was measured in lives lost. The final evaluation was a multi-day exercise that simulated a complex combat deployment, cadets rotating through different roles and scenarios designed to test every skill they'd developed over months of training. They flew against aggressor squadrons piloted by experienced combat aviators, worked with ground forces played by actual special operations personnel, and dealt with mechanical failures, weather emergencies, and communication breakdowns that forced them to adapt and problem-solve in real time. Bridger's evaluation flight put him in command of a two-ship formation, tasked with providing close air support for a ground unit in contact with enemy forces. The scenario was based on a real mission from Kine's third deployment, a nightmare situation where everything that could go wrong did go wrong. His performance was measured and competent, his decision-making solid if not inspired. He made one critical error, prioritizing the wrong target during a time-compressed engagement, a mistake that in real combat would have resulted in friendly casualties. The simulation ended with his aircraft taking simulated damage from ground fire, forcing an emergency landing at a forward airstrip. In the debrief, Kine walked him through the decision tree, showing him where his tactical analysis had gone wrong and why. "You were thinking like a pilot," she said, "when you needed to be thinking like the infantry squad that was depending on you. They don't care about the optimal attack angle or weapons conservation. They care about the machine gun nest that's about to overrun their position. When you prioritize the armored vehicle over the heavy weapon position, you made a reasonable tactical choice that got people killed." Bridger absorbed the criticism without defensiveness, his face showing the concentration of someone processing new information and integrating it into his mental framework. How do you learn to think like ground forces? You listen to them. You read their after-action reports. You sit in on their planning sessions when they'll let you. You remember that they're the ones bleeding when our decisions are wrong. Kine pulled up the actual mission footage from the scenario Bridger had just flown, showing him how she'd handled the same situation 7 years earlier. "I made the same mistake you did, first time I flew this kind of mission. Except it wasn't a simulation, and 3 Rangers died because I was too focused on the bigger threat instead of the immediate one. I've never forgotten their names. Don't let this be a lesson you have to learn in blood." The graduation ceremony was held on a Friday afternoon. The class assembled in their dress uniforms